Hi, and welcome to our first lecture on the integumentary system. Now, when you think integumentary system, you probably realize that it's your skin, and the main component of it is the skin, which is known as the cutaneous membrane, and your skin obviously covers your whole body. But there's also accessory structures on it, things like your hair, your fingernails, even the glands are part of it. Now, we actually did the glands back in the last chapter when we talked about tissues, but just know that sweat glands and oil glands are also part of the integumentary system. So when we look at this system, your skin is the main part. It's the largest organ in the human body. It's about 7% of your body weight. And when we look at the skin, technically the skin has two components. It has the epidermis, which is the superficial layer. That's the layer that you see. And then you have the dermis, which is deeper, and you don't see that. Excuse me. Now, you might remember that the epidermis is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And it's all dead, by the way, right? When they say beauty is skin deep, I guess they know that your hair is dead, your skin is dead, because all those cells are too far away from the blood supply. Now, the dermis is below it, and we'll be talking about that in more detail in a later lecture. But I know you've heard of your subcutaneous layer, and we call this the hypodermis. Now, just to make it confusing, the hypodermis is not part of the skin. It's not part of the integumentary system. So it's there, it's below it, it's connective tissue, but it's not technically part of the skin. Kind of a weird thing there. When we look at why do we have the integumentary system, well, obviously the first thing that probably pops in mind is protection, right? So it protects us in several different ways. So one is just mechanical, right? Just things that we touch, things that we brush against, right? So it's going to help protect. It's mechanically strong as far as, like not pulling apart or opening. In fact, and all of these are pretty much related, but when we look at the skin, it's a very, very strong barrier. So we want to have this mechanical barrier so things can't get in. In addition to a physical barrier, it also produces some acids and oils and sweat. And these things form what's called an antiseptic layer on your skin. What an antiseptic does is it basically decreases the growth of bacteria. So our skin has a slightly acidic pH, which helps protect us from pathogens. So not only are we protected because our skin is our first line of defense, right? If it's intact, we have a mechanical, we also have a chemical barrier. It also helps protect us from our environment. So when we're thinking about things in our environment, like, things we might come in contact with, UV radiation, for example, things that like acids or heat, our skin also helps protect us from those things in our environment. So number one, protection. Number two, it does provide sensation. When we think of our sense of touch, we think of our skin, and touch gives us a lot of information. And you can see that there are many different types of touch receptors. We are going to focus on three, the free nerve endings, and then these two guys are encapsulated. You'll see they have this layer of cells around them, and then these are called free nerve endings or naked dendrites, and we'll look at those shortly, but these help and are very important in our sense of touch. Then we have thermoregulation, and we talked about this a little bit back in chapter 1 when we looked at homeostasis, but basically what our skin does is it helps us regulate temperature because we can control blood flow to the surface of our skin. So if we have more blood flow to the surface, that's called vasodilation, or we can decrease blood flow to our skin called vasoconstriction. So think about where the blood goes, the heat goes, because our internal body cavities are a little bit warmer. So if we are getting too warm, so our body temperature has gone up, well, that's going to send information. We have basically our negative feedback loop. The stimulus is body temperature goes up. The receptors are thermoreceptors. They're going to be in your skin, and they're going to go tell the brain, the area of the brain, hey, I'm getting warm. What the brain will do is send information out to the effectors, which will cause two things to happen. One, the blood vessels are going to open up. They're going to get bigger, so more blood flows to the surface of your body, and you have that pink or red color, because when it flows to the surface and your skin might feel warm, you're releasing heat. If that doesn't release enough heat, then you're going to start to sweat, and we're going to have our sensible perspiration to sweat. Now, what if it's too cold? Well, similar idea. We have a stimulus, body temperature decreases. The receptors, the thermoreceptors, this time respond to too cold. Information goes to the brain. It tells the effectors this time, hey, constrict. So less blood flows to your skin, and you might notice you might get a little bluish tinge underneath your nails or around your lips. Now, in extreme cases, the brain would also trigger shivering. But shivering is more muscle contractions to generate heat, not just due to skin response. Our integumentary system gets rid of waste. When we sweat, we get rid of waste products. So sweat has water and salt, and it also has something called urea. Now, we've talked about urea before. When you eat protein, you have nitrogen, and you got to take that amino group and convert it into ammonia. And then ammonia gets converted into urea. So it's a waste product we need to eliminate. Now, most of that is eliminated in the urine, but you do eliminate a little bit of that in your sweat. Vitamin D production. So I know you've heard of vitamin D before, and you may know that in our skin, we have cells that are able to take sunlight. They take basically UV radiation, and they convert it into a steroid, which is like cholesterol, and that gets converted to something called vitamin D3 or cholecalciferol. Now, you'll never have to write cholecalciferol. Vitamin D3 is fine. So it's made in response to sunlight. Now, you need that. It's a precursor. That goes to your liver processes it and sends it to your kidney. And the kidney makes a hormone called calcitriol, which is basically active vitamin D. That's what your small intestine needs in order to absorb calcium. So vitamin D has a lot of roles that they're discovering with it. It is important to have enough of it, so it does help absorb calcium, but it also, they've looked at this with immune system, they've looked at it with MS. So they say that you need about 20 minutes of sunlight a day in order to make vitamin D. But you know, as we get into winter and we have less sun, it might be good or to get your levels checked and then possibly consider taking a supplement, especially in the winter time. Now, next we're going to move on and talk about the epidermis, or that top layer of the skin. And if you look at it, again, it's stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and your epidermis has a lot of keratin in it. Now, keratin is a waterproofing protein. We've talked a little bit about collagen, and there's collagen here too, but keratin specifically is really good at preventing your skin from drying out. Just like all epithelial tissue, it's avascular, and it's dependent on the dermis for the blood supply. So the epidermis, you can see how many layers it is here, how it's layered over the dermis. So the blood supply is down here in the dermis. So I'll just write blood supply. Now, the cells that are closest to the dermis are alive. They're going to replicate. But what happens is as they replicate, the cells get pushed up. And so as they get closer to the surface, they all die because they're too far away from the blood. And you can see that they look different. These look pretty healthy. These are all flat. You don't really see nuclei because as they move to the surface, they rupture and they die, and then we slough them off. Every day we lose a bunch of cells. So they say that we shed about 1 million cells off our epidermis daily. So when we look at the epidermis, it's classified as having these strata or layers. They say there's 4 of these in thin skin and 5 in thick. Now that doesn't mean cell layers. You can see there's many, many layers of cells here, but there's just 4 to 5 layers. So if we go in order from deep to superficial, the basal is the deepest. The next one's called the lucidum, and that's the one that's in blue because, actually I just jumped one, I'm sorry. The basal is the deepest. Let me try this again. Then you have the spinosum, the granulosum. The lucidum is in blue because that's the only one that's found in thick skin. And the corneum is the one that you see. That's the most superficial one. So we're going to look at these next. All right, so think of stratum basal. You can call it the germatavum. I just say the basal. It's the deepest layer. Now, the stratum basal, you can see right here, it's usually about 1 layer of cells. It's not super thick, but these are stem cells. So these are cells that are they're right next to the dermis. They have the best blood supply, right? So they're the healthiest cells. They're the stem cells. They're going to be making all the cells of your epidermis. You can think of them as being closest to the basal lamina, basal bottom, right? They actually interlock with the dermis pretty tightly to hold on to the epidermis. So these guys are the most active in mitosis because you have all of these cells migrating and sloughing off, so you have to replace them, and also in the production of vitamin D3. Now, a blister, if you have your dermis and your epidermis and you have a lot of friction, it can separate. So a blister is usually due to friction, and the epidermis, the dermis separate, and often that gets filled with a little bit of fluid. And if you just leave it alone, it'll usually heal on its own. The next layer, so we had the basal down here. The next layer up is the spinosum. Now, the spinosum is fairly thick. You can see here it has a lot of cells, and it's called the spinosum because someone thought they looked kind of spiky. The cells here do undergo mitosis. They are alive, maybe just not as fast as the ones that are in the basal layer. Now, if we move up from the spinosum, look at the granulosum. You're starting to see a difference in how the cells look. So this is a very thin layer. It has a lot of granules, and the granules here are going to have keratin, and then they also have a bunch of lipids. And what happens is once we get to the granulosum, the cells die. So this is when the cells are starting to die. They're too far away from the blood supply. They can't get the oxygen and the nutrients. And when they die, they rupture. And so all these granules here are keratin and lipids, and they get dispersed throughout the skin, which provides a barrier. So remember, keratin's a waterproofing protein. You might remember that lipids are hydrophobic. They don't like water. So now you're starting to put this layer down of keratin and these hydrophobic lipids, which is going to form a barrier to water and also anything polar, right? So polar materials won't be able to get through that. And this is what's called keratinization, when cells pop and they rupture and you deposit all that keratin in there. Now, lucidum is the one I jumped at a minute ago. You can see it's a very thin layer, and it's only found in thick skin. Okay. So you might be saying, well, where's thick skin? Okay, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but basically thick skin is the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Everywhere else is thin. All right, the top layer is the corneum. Some sources say it's the thickest layer of the epidermis. It's pretty, the spinosum and the corneum are pretty thick. It's your outer layer. It's all dead. It's even thicker in thick skin, okay? And it has many, many layers of those keratinized cells. So this is your first line of defense. This is what's coming in contact with your environment, your outside world. So we know that it takes roughly 15 to 30 days for, remember, the mitosis happens down here in the basal layer, and then it moves up, so it migrates. So it's roughly 15 to 30 days to get up in the corneum, and then it could be 1 to 2 weeks before it's washed away. So I just say, generally speaking, let's just say 30 days for a cell to get from the basal all the way up to the cornea and being sloughed off. So if you get one of those henna tattoos, or you have this really cool I don't know, suntan that you love, or a temporary tattoo, it's going to last about 30 days before it's shed. The other thing about the corneum is that it's water resistant, but it's not technically waterproof. We lose water through our skin, and that's called insensible perspiration. So you might notice in the wintertime, your skin is drier because when there's lower humidity around us, water can evaporate through our skin. So it's not truly waterproof. And because water can enter and exit our skin, we can see changes to our cells based on what type of environment we put our bodies in. So if you were to soak in a bath water, or if we're going to talk about fresh water, so let's talk about the cells. So you might remember from Bio 119 that most cells, their tonicity is 0.9% NaCl. So that's the salt concentration in most of our body cells. So if we were to sit, let me look at your notes, in fresh water. Okay, so we're going to take a bath, a regular bath. I'm not doing the Epsom salt yet. So if you're in a bath or you're in fresh water, we're going to assume that that's like lower solutes, so maybe like 0% solutes. So what happens is, if you got to remember this stuff, osmotic pressure, water's going to enter your cells in your body. And when water enters your cells, your fingers, like they look like they get really swollen, right? They look wrinkly, but if you look closely, the cells are actually bigger because the water enters the cells. if we were to go in seawater, let me get a different color here. So if we were lost at sea, you might know the ocean is very salty. So I think the ocean, don't hold me to this, but I think it's about 1.5%. So it's salty. So if you're in seawater, now what's going to happen is water's going to leave your cells, right? Water always goes to where there's more stuff, more solutes. And so water would leave, which would be a problem because you'll dehydrate faster. So you might have heard of using these Epsom salts before. And what happens with an Epsom salt bath is that when you soak, you put these in, they're usually magnesium. Magnesium and another salt. I don't remember the second salt, but usually a lot of magnesium. So you sit in it and it's very, very salty. So it actually will draw the water out of your body. So it's good if you have a lot of inflammation or swelling somewhere and you soak the limb, it actually can help it move. Which brings me also to, you've probably heard of topical medications. These are things that you put on your skin. Now, a lot of times they're supposed to treat something locally, like in your skin. Maybe you have a skin irritation, so it's like a cream or a lotion. But just know that if they go through your skin, they will reach your blood supply. So you can actually give medication this way too. It's a patch usually that they do. So something to keep in mind for this is that in order to get through that epidermis, remember that you have to have a lipid. So if we're looking at any drug that's going to be given transdermally, it has to be a lipid because remember that layer was hydrophobic. And so only other, like dissolves like, you may have heard that before, only other lipids are able to get through that. And also know that sometimes some poisons or toxins are lipid soluble, and then you want to make sure that you have gloves on because otherwise they could be absorbed in your body that way. Now, when we're looking at the cells of the epidermis, we're going to focus on three types: the keratinocytes, the melanocytes, and some of those receptors or tactile cells. So keratinocytes are the majority of the cells. In fact, if you look at this picture, all these pink and purple and tan cells, they're all keratinocytes. So the majority of cells are keratinocytes. They're connected by those desmosomes. Remember, those were junctions that gave a little bit. And again, they're going to undergo mitosis and be pushed towards the surface. But as they get towards the surface, they're going to die and then they're going to be shed. And I told you that it's about 1 million a day. And they say if you look at household dust, that most of household dust is our own body cells. I guess just something to think about. Melanocytes. They make a pigment called melanin. Now, you say melanin or melanin. It's usually a brownish pigment. There are some other slightly different colors of it. We'll focus on the brown one. But melanin is formed in the cell. Now, I always say these cells look like a spider. You see this brown cell here? So this is the cell. It's making it. And those little black dots here are the pigment. So it's made in the cell. And then it travels out through the processes. And then this pink thing is a keratinocyte. The keratinocyte picks it up. It gets deposited in the keratinocyte. The keratinocyte migrates. So what happens is the melanocyte stays behind, by the way. Most of the melanocytes are down in the basal layer. So you can see down here really deep is where they tend to hang out. They don't migrate. But their job is to make melanin, put it in the keratinocyte, and you might notice it kind of comes over the nucleus because the melanin is a pigment and it's like a little umbrella for UV radiation for the nucleus because the nucleus has the DNA and you don't want UV radiation to hit your DNA because it can mutate it. So it makes the melanin, it moves it out. It's called melanosome. It's just a little vesicle that moves it. The keratinocyte picks it up and then the keratinocyte is going to travel towards the surface because that's what they do. And then it'll eventually die and be shed, so you're constantly making this. Now, your skin color depends more on the activity. Everyone has about the same number of melanocytes. It's just if they're more active or they're more spread, then you're going to have a darker skin color just because of the melanin. You have more of it. Because its job is to protect our cells from UV radiation, if we get exposed to UV radiation, they're going to be more active. So when you go in the sun or you're exposed to UV radiation, melanocytes make more pigment. That's why your skin would get darker in response to sunlight, to UV radiation. But we know that if it's prolonged UV radiation, guys, it's going to damage your cells, right? It can damage fibroblasts, damages the dermis, it causes premature wrinkling, and we know it causes skin cancer, and that'll be in your clinical application. Have you ever seen a mole before? A mole is considered a benign growth. So it's a tumor, but it's benign. It's not traveling anywhere. It's when you have a bunch of melanocytes that are too active and they make a whole bunch of dark pigment. That's why you check your moles, because when you see a typical mole, it's not cancer, but those moles can change and become cancer. So you always want to keep an eye on them. More about that in the clinical. Freckles. Freckles are patches of melanocytes that are more active. And so you might notice that your freckles come out more in the sunlight because the melanocytes are more active in the sunlight. Some other things that can affect skin color, there's something called vitiligo, and this, they think it might be an autoimmune disease where the immune system attacks the melanocytes. So if it attacks the melanocytes, you're going to end up with patches of skin with no color. And so it appears to be related to that. And then I wanted to mention albinism. I thought that was a cool picture of an albino lion. So albinism is genetic, an autosomal recessive. So what that means is you have to have 2 copies of the recessive gene to have it, but you don't make melanin. So you don't make melanin, then your hair will be white, your skin will be very white, and also melanin causes your eye color. So you'll have clear eyes, or usually they look kind of like a light pink color. Now, another cell is called a dendritic cell. I don't think I had this on the first slide, but I want to mention these. They're called Langerhans cells. This is big blue thing right here. They tend to hang out in the stratum spinosum. And these are a special type of macrophage. So they are a macrophage, which you probably know eats things. So they help with protection of the skin and the immune patrols. They're kind of patrolling your skin to eat up debris or old cells or even pathogens if they get in. And then the nerve receptors, or the tactile cells, again, there's a whole bunch of them. We're not doing all of these. I want to focus on these free nerve endings. And the free nerve endings are basically just dendrites. Sometimes they're actually called naked dendrites. They're just literally an exposed nerve. They're just exposed dendrites. And these are the main pain receptors. You've got a dendrite just hanging out. Remember, the dendrite's part of a neuron. So they're in the skin. I don't know if you can see it real well there. They also help with light touch, but they're very responsible for triggering pain. So I talked a little bit about thick versus thin skin. We said that thick skin was found in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. It has all 5 layers. Thin skin only has 4 layers. And by the way, when you're trying to memorize these layers, your book has a little mnemonic device for it. There's one that a student told me a while ago. I don't agree with it, but it might help you, because that one says, "Come, let's get sunburned." Not fun, but if that helps you remember the layers as well, go for it. And then we also know, if we look at thick skin versus thin skin, you can maybe see a little better on the picture. Notice that thick skin does not have hair, right? No hair follicles. No sebaceous glands. It does have sweat glands, though. Remember, you have a lot of sweat glands in the palm of your hand and your fingers especially. Thin skin, on the other hand, has the 4 layers. It's thinner. Again, we're not memorizing the numbers here for the thickness and the thinness. I put 0.4 to 0.6, and just to give you rough ideas of size here. But you'll see that the thick skin is a little thicker, and that your thin skin has your hair follicles, right? Plenty of hair follicles, and you also are going to have sebaceous glands with that. So this finishes our first lecture on the integumentary system.